Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. All right, this morning we're going to talk about Shabbat, talk about Sabbath a little bit, talk about palaces and Shabbat, palaces and Sabbath, and how these things are related. Layman, a couple of weeks ago, talked about Sabbath a little bit, so I'm trying not to cover some of the same material, but we'll talk a little bit about Sabbath and what it means to us today, what this portion tells us about Sabbath, what it shows us, and how we should regard it. So, the first verse here opens up, "Then Moses gathered all the congregation of the children of Israel together and said to them, 'These are the words which the Lord has commanded to you.'" So we get our Torah portion, like many times I'll bring it up. We get our portion name, Vayachel, he gathered, right? We get it from the first verse of the portion. Many times that happens. It's the first word or within the first sentence of the portion here. So Vayachel means he gathered together. And so when we look at what happened prior to this, and we see all the things that have gone on thus far, we have the Exodus. God brings Israel out of Egypt. God brings them out into the wilderness. God brings them to the mountain, tells them to prepare the people. The people prepare, they bathe, they put on new garments, they go and they prepare to worship God at the mountain, Mount Sinai. And then Moses goes up. And so we see all this, and we see all these instructions that come before this. We see the Ten Commandments. We see the commandments for the tabernacle, because here we are, we're still being instructed on what the tabernacle is supposed to look like. This is now the third, if I counted correctly, the third Exodus. No, it's more than that. Multiple instances where we've been instructed on Shabbat, right? We've been instructed several times, and we look at it today in our reading, and we say, we've heard this before. We've heard this in the weeks past. We've heard this for the past 2 months. Shabbat. What is God trying to tell me today? Why does he mention it again? Why are these things not together in one place? And at least for me, and maybe not for you, maybe you look at it a different way, but I look at the verses leading up to this, and I just see it from my eyes. I say, this is what I'm reading in the book. This is what applies to me. This is what God has given to me, and I read in this way. But the people of Israel at that time, they didn't have that luxury of looking back and saying, this is what God has shown. Because why? This is the first time that Moses has instructed the people of Israel from God. And I don't know why that seems significant to me this week, this year. I've never paused and looked at the fact that up until now, Moses has not instructed the people yet. Remember, the people heard the Ten Commandments. They heard the commandments from God, and he instructed that himself. And the people said, please, speak no more lest we die. Have some, and God brings Moses up, and Moses is going to speak on behalf of them. Moses goes up on the mountain, right? And he's going to stay up there for 40 days, and he's going to come back, and then what happens? The golden calf. But we'll get to that in a minute. But this is the first time that Moses has gathered the people together and said, here's what God wants me to impart to you. And it's a long time, right? So we have the Exodus that happened in the beginning of the Hebrew year, the Nisan or Abib 14, 15. And they come out, they go into the wilderness. We've got about 2 months between there and the time that they make it to Mount Sinai, almost 2 months, 50 days, Pentecost, Shavuot. And then here we are, and we'll look at a timeline in a minute, we're still another 2 to 3 months later. These people have been hanging out in the desert for quite some time with no instruction from the person who led them out there to begin with. So with that in mind, what's the very first thing that Moses, when he gathers the people together, he says, you've heard the Ten Commandments, you've seen God's power and his might, you've seen God bring you out of Egypt, you've seen God bring you through the Red Sea, you've seen him bring you to a mountain, you've seen his wrath, you've seen what happens when you don't do what he's supposed to do because people have just died. And what's the first thing that he wants to tell Israel when he brings them together? Work shall be done for 6 days. But the seventh day shall be a holy day for you, a Sabbath of rest to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire throughout your dwellings on the Sabbath day. the very first thing that Moses imparts to Israel when he gathers them together and starts to relay the instructions of God and how Israel is supposed to act, the very first thing that he utters to them is, you shall have a Sabbath, you shall rest. And I find this significant. He's going to say this one thing, 2 verses about Sabbath, and then the rest of the portion is going to be about the tabernacle. It's going to be about building God's house. We already have the instructions because remember, we have the book. We have the luxury of looking back and saying we're going through the journey with God every year. Israel didn't have the luxury of knowing that God's already imparted to Moses what the tabernacle is supposed to look like. So here is Moses imparting to the people what God's already imparted to him. So he's going to say, remember to keep the Sabbath day. All right, now let's talk about God's tabernacle. Let's talk about his house. But what's interesting is the last time that we talked about this here was Laman. He spoke on Sabbath, and that was because it was just a few portions back. Exodus 31. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak also to the children of Israel, saying, Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep. For it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death, for whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among the people. So just a few weeks ago, we had almost the identical instruction. That's kind of, this week we hear the instruction against creating fire on the Sabbath. Back then, a few weeks ago, he elaborated more on the profanity of it and putting people to death on it. But it's generally the same instruction, right? We have the Sabbath instruction. What's even more interesting to me as I look at it this week, both of them were surrounding the building of the tabernacle, right? This week, we start off, we have the instruction for Shabbat. And from there, we're going to go forward and we're going to hear nothing for the rest of the portion except for things that are going to be in the tabernacle, how to build the tabernacle. Well, this portion back here started off with all things concerning the tabernacle, and this is how you build my tabernacle, and it ends, but don't forget to keep my Shabbat. So you have these 2 instances where the portion is grouped together with the tabernacle and the Sabbath, and why is that important to us? Why is that so? Why did God, he didn't say here's the Torah portions and how you should separate them, right? But I believe that there's a reason and a purpose that God inspired men to study his Torah every week, every Shabbat in the synagogues, right? So I think that that's somewhat divinely inspired. But he still grouped these things together in his Torah. He still chose to put Sabbath in there multiple times, and he chose to put them right next to the tabernacle construction. Why? But first I want to get to the timeline. So you have these, just so everybody has a picture of what I was trying to say a while ago, you have this 10 commandments, right? These words are uttered and Moses ascends, and then what happens? You have the golden calf. He has to come down. He breaks the tablets. He renders judgment, divine judgment. People die because they've sinned against God. Moses ascends again, and he's going to spend 40 days pleading with God. He's going to say, God, please have mercy on Israel for your sake, for your name's sake, so that the nations around you will know that you are the true God. Have mercy on Israel. I plead with you for 40 days. And then for the next 40 days, he's going to talk about these second set of tablets. And God's going to, Moses has now chiseled them out, and God's still going to put the same things on them that were on them before. And then Moses descends, and that's where we're at. And what's that timeline look like for us? When we look at this from a timeline perspective, I don't know how big that comes up pretty good. I can't see it too well on this thing, but so you have Shavuot, this time of the giving of the 10 Commandments, this time of coming before the mountain and God giving that pure milk of the Word, the instructions of what it looks like to obey God. And he goes up for 40 days and he comes back down, and you have this golden calf experience, and then 40 days. And where does that end us? Where does that leave us? Leaves us right at Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So the Day of Atonement, Moses comes down from God right on the Day of Atonement, or some would suggest right after, the day after. And the first thing he utters is not, don't do the golden calf thing again. Don't do this other thing again. Don't do, all these other things that he could mention out of the 613. He says, rest on Shabbat. Make sure that you take a Sabbath. Make sure that you honor God in his Sabbath. And what does it mean to rest on Shabbat? And I bring this up because we talk about this, and I'm not here to tell you what you should do here. I just want to give a suggestion. I'm sure I've mentioned it before, but I find it no coincidence that Sabbath is connected here to the tabernacle twice, the construction of the tabernacle. And I think it was the last time I was up here, my turn to speak, that I brought about the idea that the tabernacle was divinely and intimately connected to creation, that God's creation was not complete until the tabernacle was finished. And we see that language within Exodus. We see it next week as the Exodus story ends. We see that language there within the text of Exodus that starts off with a hint at Sabbath. It starts off with a hint at creation, because he brought Moses up and he said, Moses, stay here for 6 days. On the seventh day, then we'll talk. On the seventh day, then come and worship me and let's have fellowship. So you have that at the beginning of this creation idea of the tabernacle. So you see this divinely connected, the tabernacle and Sabbath and creation. And it's real simple. We go back to the very first instance of Shabbat. And what did it mean? What was it for God? It was a ceasing from all creation. And there's no wonder why God placed this instruction here right before, right after, right in the midst of this construction instruction for the tabernacle. God says, as you're creating, as you're building up this house for me, don't forget that the Sabbath supersedes that. Don't forget that above all instructions, the first thing that I want my servant Moses to tell to you is to rest and allow your people to rest. Don't forget that even though this is my house you're about to build, that does not circumvent the fact that you should rest to honor the fact that I created all of the universe. So what does it mean to rest? Matthew 12 gives us a hint that says, or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. Is Yeshua there saying that the priest sinned against God on the Sabbath? No. Is he saying something wrong here? Because I can't find anywhere in the Torah, anywhere in the law, that says the priests are going to sin on the Sabbath. They're going to profane the Sabbath. No, he's speaking to something that was a common understood thing, that if you took these things and you put them outside of the temple, you take these things and what they do, they're laboring, they're picking up, they're processing all of the worship, and it was their busiest day of the week. But was that labor to God? We would place it in ours. Sometimes we put our own chains and balls on ourselves and say, Will, you shouldn't be doing that because don't you see what it says here? Well, wait a minute. Is that God's intent? Is that what God intended for Sabbath? Did God intend that we should cease all worship so that we don't have to drive somewhere, or cease all worship so that we don't have to get dressed and get up out of our beds? He didn't intend that. What does rest versus God's house mean? It means that God said that even though you're building this for me, it doesn't supersede the fact that you're to rest. It doesn't supersede that I've given you a sign so that all creation will know that I am the creator of the universe, because in 6 days I created, and on the seventh day I ceased from all creation. I stopped creating things. I stopped building things. I stopped building up anything that I could on that seventh day. And what does this look like to the world that Israel lived in? I love to talk about the ancient Near Eastern perspective. I've been going to school for 2.5 years now, focused in that area. What did it look like to the world around them? What did it look like to see a nation whose God, whose king, whose priestly order says the people are greater than me? The well-being of my people, of my servants, are better than the one who's to be worshipped, or the one who's to be above all. He says, my people deserve a rest. Their well-being, their livelihood is more important than the house and the palace and the temple that they would build for me. We don't have to look outside the Bible. We can see this within the Bible. Exodus, right at the beginning, says, therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. You study these two cities, we don't necessarily know exactly where these cities are in archaeology today. We have some pretty good ideas that the city of Ramses was surprised in the midst of Goshen, the most rich soil in all of Egypt. But both of these, what's important about both of these is that they're both big cities of worship. We know this from Egyptian texts. These were big cities of worship, so the Israelites were bound by their king at that time. They were bound by the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, and they were told, you will work for me and build my palaces. You will build my sanctuaries. You will build these great places for me to live. Forget the fact that you need to rest. Forget the fact that you need to recover so that you can continue to work and labor. That doesn't matter. What matters is that Pharaoh needs a new temple. What matters is that this king needs a new place to live. And if that means that some of you die in the meantime, then so be it. Because you serve me, I don't serve you. That was the idea. That was the idea there. Palace and temple are the same thing, right? Even the Hebrew word for temple means palace. It's the same thing, because where a God would dwell would be his house. Where God dwells is his house. So when God's saying, build me a house, build me a place of worship, he's saying, build me a house as well. And so when we look at that, that's how we can connect the way Israel looked to the people around them. These people would look at Israel and say, I wouldn't doubt that Egypt looked and said, look, they don't even have a God who has a temple. They've got some little tent, right? They might have even made fun of them at one point. These people, sure, their God did mighty things, but he doesn't even have a big palace. Later in Exodus, we see, so the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage and mortar and brick and all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. They had no rest. They had no break from their labor towards this king who was self-serving, who looked to serve himself and make sure that everybody else served him. Later in the Bible, we have another great king, Sennacherib. And Sennacherib was a king of Assyria. That's kind of where I get into my stuff I really like. He was the king of Assyria, and his palace, his great capital was in Nineveh, right? We all know where Nineveh's at. It's in modern-day Iraq, and so he had these great palaces. Well, he's going to come in. He's going to bring the Assyrians in about 600-700 years after the Exodus, and they're going to come in. They're going to lay siege to Lachish, a city that's not far from Jerusalem, close enough to where they could see the fires from each other's cities and know their well-being. But 2 Chronicles 32 says, after these deeds of faithfulness, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and entered Judah. He encamped against the fortified cities, thinking to win them over to himself. So he came in. He wanted to take Jerusalem, right? That's what every king that's coming in and overtaking another city, that's what they want to do. They want to go in. What did the U.S. do when they went into Iraq? They wanted to push forward and take Baghdad. They had to take the capital and cut off that stronghold. So Sennacherib's idea, he's going to come in from the north, he's going to come down, he's going to swoop down along the coastal plains, and then he's going to cut over and take Jerusalem. Doesn't exactly happen like that. A few verses later it says, after this, Sennacherib, king of Syria, sent his servants to Jerusalem. But he and all the forces with him laid siege to Lachish, to Hezekiah, king of Judah, and to all of Judah who were in Jerusalem, saying. So he sent some people to Jerusalem. He's not going to end up taking Jerusalem. That'll fall later on. But he takes Lachish. He takes this city outside of Jerusalem. And why is this important? We have archaeology. He goes back later, and he's going to build this big palace in Nineveh. And he's going to build this big room in his palace. It's going to be called the Victory Room, right? And he's going to have these big reliefs made out of clay all over. And this is an example of one. These are in the British Museum. There we go. So what you have here is just a very small portion, because these things are ginormous and they encompass this huge palatial room. And what you have here, the people on the left are the Assyrians, and it seems kind of gruesome. And how does this apply to Sabbath? We'll get there, right? But these people laid out, they're Israelites. The people are laid out are Israelites. And Assyria was known to be the most gruesome and fierce people. They would lay them out, flay them. Think Braveheart. Anybody seen Braveheart? And what they did during Braveheart? That's what Assyria did to all the people they conquered, right? They would flay them out. So this is a depiction of them conquering Lachish. And it's not only, it's not a good sign for Israel, it's not a good symbol for Israel, but the best evidence we have when we're dealing with people who try to say the Bible's a lie and it didn't really happen. The best evidence we have is from other countries, other kings who say, well, I laid siege to Israel. And so this is what Sennacherib did. He said, I laid siege to Israel. I flayed them out like this. This is what I did to the people at Lachish. And there's lots of depictions there. You can see the Israelites in the towers shooting down at the people that were coming in to take them over. But here we have another depiction here. So they didn't flay everybody, right? They also took them captive. So there to the left you see the Assyrian soldiers, and then to the right you see a family being taken into captive. They're being taken back to Assyria to do what? To serve Sennacherib, to serve him. They found themselves due to their, and the prophets will tell us, due to their own sin, their own rebellion against God, they're going to find themselves in the same situation that they were in when God delivered them. They had forgotten what God had done. So these people here, you see a man carrying a box and his family's right on a horse. They're going to go and serve Sennacherib the same way their fathers served Pharaoh in Egypt. They're going to go and they're going to build Sennacherib a palace. And he's not going to care. He's not going to care what, he's already killed half of the people in Lachish and all of Judea. He's not going to care what happens to him. He just cares that he has this, right? That he has this big palatial space that he can say, this is mine. That's what mankind does. That's what men do. And we all do that in some little instance, right? Because I'm Pharaoh at times. I'm Pharaoh, and at times I'm looking for people to serve me, and how can you benefit me? And we all do this in our little nuances, in our little ways that we sometimes unwittingly, unknowingly, we know that we abuse our friends, abuse our family. We take people and we manipulate them so that they can do something for me, for my good, for my benefit. We're acting like Pharaoh. We're acting like the people that were against God. We all do that. But what does God do? He doesn't do this, right? He's going to eventually have a palace, but it's not going to look like this. This is where he starts, right here. He starts with a little tent, and he says, hey, look, build this tent for me. And we see this text, and we see all these long texts about the details of everything there, but when we just look at it, we say, well, it's not that much. He didn't lay this heavy burden on his people. He says, rest. You got a long journey ahead of you. You're going to be out here in the desert for 40 years. You're going to have to move this thing every so often. Rest. Make sure that you're recuperated. My people matter to me. I'm a king who loves my people so much that I don't need a big palace in the desert. Rest. Even when we get to, later on, this is the second temple. Even then, you compare that to what Sennacherib required. It pales in comparison, right? It pales in comparison. He set it on a hill that wasn't even the highest hill in Jerusalem. He set it on a hill, a modest little hill, the Temple Mount, Mount Moriah. It's modest. God in his humility said, I don't need you to serve me in the way that all these kings around you force their people into service to them. I don't need you to serve me in a way that all these other kings force you, Israel, at times to come in and serve them. But I do this as an example because this is how we should serve each other. So what do we do on the Sabbath? What do we do with it? What is our goal? How does that look for us today? What does that look like? Sometimes we serve ourselves. Do we make ourselves Pharaoh when it comes to Sabbath? Nehemiah, he had some reforms, right? He had some reforms in Israel, and I just want to go over a couple of those for just a minute. And I find it interesting. As I read back through it, I went here for the obvious reason that he's going to talk about Sabbath. But what does he start off with? In verse 7 of Nehemiah 13, it says, And I came to Jerusalem and discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, and preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. And it grieved me bitterly. Therefore I threw all the household goods of Tobiah out of the room. What's the first thing he notices? He comes up and he says, you've made this palace your palace. You've set yourself on the same stance as Pharaoh. Remember back when God brought you out of Egypt? Remember when he brought you out and he said, build a house for me? That house was for him. That house is not for you. Just a few verses later, 10 and 11, it says, I also realized that the portions for the Levites had not been given. For each of the Levites and the singers who did the work had gone back to the field. Those people that were supposed to be serving and making sure that God's order of his service and his worship was going about as it was supposed to be done, they couldn't do that anymore. They had to go work in the field to make sure that they could live, because nobody was doing what God had said to give them their due. So I contended with the rulers and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together. I gathered them together in this place. Gather them together in their place. And what's he going to make the next change? In those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with wines and grapes and figs and all kinds of burdens, and they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them about the day on which they were selling provisions. Men of Tyre dwelt there also, who brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. What's the very next thing that he's going to address? He says, I gathered them together. And I told them to honor the Sabbath day. God's got his house. That's his. It doesn't belong to you. But honor the Sabbath day. Rest as he rested. Show the rest of the world that he was the one who created the universe. Continuing on, then I contended with the nobles of Judah and said to them, what evil thing is this that you do by which you profane the Sabbath day? Did your fathers not do this? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us in this city? Yet you bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. Now, the way we look at the Torah today, sometimes we look at it and we say, we came from a place that said the Torah was not applicable to us. We said the Torah doesn't matter, the Torah doesn't matter. Yeshua did away with that on the cross. We don't need to do that. Now we come into Torah and what do? We look at it with such a fine-tooth comb and we say, well, it doesn't exactly say that, right? It doesn't exactly say that. It doesn't say this. I can do that. We find loopholes in the Torah, but what was the intention of God's Torah? Was his Torah, was his law, was that intended to be a comprehensive law set? A book. Today in America, we have over 2 million laws. And I think that number is growing every day, right? We have over 2 million laws, but what did we start with? What did we start with in America? Constitution, Bill of Rights, these things, these simple principles, these ideas in which our nation was built upon, these ideas that set forth the foundation of the morality and the legality that our country should be bound by. How is the Torah, its law, different than every other law in the ancient Near East? It wasn't comprehensive. It wasn't a law that said, here's exactly what you should and shouldn't do. It was a relational law. It was covenantal. It was there to give us, Israel, the groundwork, the foundation of what doing right looks like. So the people right there, they could have said, well, hang on, Nehemiah. Torah doesn't say anything about buying and selling on the Sabbath. I should be able to buy and sell on the Sabbath if I want to. But he understood the principle. The principle is that this day is a day that belongs completely to him and completely to us and to our people, and that we shouldn't be distracted by all these other things. We shouldn't be distracted by the wares of the world that want to bring us in and, as Nehemiah said, profane the Sabbath. Continuing on, so it was, what does he do? At the gates of Jerusalem, so it began to be dark before the Sabbath, that I commanded the gates to be shut and charged that they must not be opened till after the Sabbath. Then I posted some of my servants at the gates, so that no burdens would be brought on the Sabbath day. Now the merchants and the sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside of Jerusalem once or twice. They didn't stay there long. Why? Because then he warned them and he said, why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do so again, I'll lay hands on you. And from that time they came no more on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves and that they should go and guard the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember me, O God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercy. Same language there from the Exodus. Same language. As Moses comes down and he sees what Israel has done, he goes and he says, have mercy on us. We're going to fix this. We're going to make sure that we do right. Have mercy on us. Let us go forward and be your nation so that people will know you are God. But have mercy on us. And I'm going to go down and I'm going to tell them to keep the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. We have some other examples in Scripture, but what does it look like to us today? What does it mean for us? I had somebody the other day tell me, and we were discussing this principle, this idea that the Torah was not a comprehensive set of laws, a law code. It's not like Hammurabi, right? The Torah gets so many times compared to Hammurabi. You know what? His laws were comprehensive. What you saw is what you got. God's laws were relational and covenantal and theological. They were set in place so that Israel could grow from there and know how to look righteously to the rest of the world. So what does it look like today? I was having this conversation and someone said, the U.S. actually does honor the Sabbath day in some sense, right? Because we have a 40-hour work week that's required. We have these labor laws in place that require that people have rest. And I'm not saying that's comprehensive when it comes to the Sabbath, right? Because there's this huge other aspect of the Sabbath that is supposed to be a sign to all the people around that He is the one who created the universe. So I'm not saying that we can rest any day of the week, but I'm saying the principle is there. One principle, one big glaring principle of Sabbath is that it allows the people of this kingdom to have rest. Some other examples we have from Ezekiel 20:15-16 says, "So I also raised my hand in an oath to them in the wilderness that I would not bring them into the land which I had given them, flowing with milk and honey, the glory of all lands, because they despised my judgments and did not walk in my statutes, but profaned my Sabbaths, for their heart went after other idols." Ezekiel here relates the disobedience, all of the disobedience of Israel, to profane the Sabbath, because it said they despised all my judgments. They did not walk in my statutes, but they profaned my Sabbath. He compares them linguistically. He's saying, basically, if they would have just honored the Sabbath, if they would have done the first thing that Moses told them when he came down off the mountain, they would not have been lured into all these other things. They would have seen my mercy and my greatness. They wouldn't have been lured into this, and eventually their hearts wouldn't have gone after other idols. Because this is the day that God set as a sign between Him and all His people. Jeremiah 17 says, "Thus says the Lord, take heed to yourselves, and bear no burdens on the Sabbath day, nor bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem, nor carry the burden out of the house on the Sabbath day, nor do any work, but hallow the Sabbath day, as I commanded your fathers. But they did not obey nor incline their ear, but made their necks stiff, that they may not hear nor receive instruction." God says, I pleaded with you. This is in the midst of all of the sin of Jerusalem and Judah. There's plenty of things for God to contend with them against. And He does. He does so in the book of Jeremiah. But in the midst of all that, He said, if you would have just listened to the first thing I told your fathers, if you would have just stopped and paused and rested and caused others to rest, to be able to realize and reflect on who I am and the greatness of creation. Because that's what Sabbath calls us back to. But He says later in the chapter, "But if you will not heed me to hallow the Sabbath day, such as not carrying a burden when entering the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then I will kindle a fire in its gates, and I will devour the palaces of Jerusalem, and it shall not be quenched." I find it interesting that in the chapter that he says, if you would just hearken to the words that Moses first spoke to your fathers and obey the Sabbath day, these things, these calamities wouldn't come upon you. He even then calls back to our portion, because our portion is the only portion that Sabbath and kindling of fire is mentioned together in all of the Torah. He says, if you would just do this, and if you would just obey and rest and understand what this day is about and understand what it means, then I wouldn't kindle a fire on it. Your sin has now caused me to kindle a fire on this day, because now I'm going to kindle a fire and I'm going to devour Jerusalem. He right here, and Jeremiah is full of all kinds of atrocious sins that Israel does, but he says right here in 17 that because they wouldn't hearken to the very first instruction they received from Moses, all of Jerusalem would be laid waste and they would be carried off. Isaiah 1, "To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices to me, says the Lord? I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and of the fat of fed cattle. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or in the lamb of goats. When you come to appear before me, who has required this from your hand to trample my courts? Now, right here, he's not specifically talking about the Sabbath. But what were the greatest days of offerings were his Sabbaths, the Sabbath day, the high days surrounding his feast days. And what had they done? A lot of people use this verse to say that, well, you know what? God didn't require any sacrifice. If you read Isaiah, it says that he didn't require this. Who required this? Nobody required blood to be shed in my temple, in my palace. They'll use this verse and other verses like it in Amos and Jeremiah and say, God never wanted sacrifice. Well, that's ignoring the entire context of the rest of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, the entire Torah, Kings, Chronicles, right? What's the point here? The point was that they profaned his house by doing so, by doing these offerings, by keeping Sabbath without a right heart, without truly devoted to God, because that's the purpose. The purpose is to remind us that we are God's, that we belong to him, the one who created the universe. Why is it so important? Because it was created for us. He didn't create all these things and then create animals and then the Sabbath so that animals could have a rest. He didn't create all these things and then lastly, here comes the plants and make sure you don't just don't chop any plants down on the Sabbath. No, he created all the universe and it culminates with creation of mankind, the people who would worship God, the people that God desired to have in his kingdom. And then he says, now I'm going to rest. As an example to you and how you're going to rest, I'm going to rest. I made this day for you. Does God need to rest? God's not human, right? But he gives us an example as a real leader would. He gives us the example of what it means to work and have a day of rest and recuperation. Exodus 31, verse 17, is a sign between me and you and the children of Israel forever. Why is it so important? Why is this day important? Why do we need to sometimes relook at how we're treating it? I know I do. I'm the first to say there are times when I need to step back and say, I've allowed the common, the mundane, the everyday to seep its way into my God's Sabbath. I've allowed these common things that I can do for 6 days, I've allowed them to come and find their way into God's Sabbath. But he says that shouldn't happen because it's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days God made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. When we do the things that we want to do, when Matt Nappier says, I know it's Shabbat, but you know what? I really want to do this today. This has nothing to do with God. It has nothing to do with his creation, his sovereignty, his kingship. It has all to do with me wanting to serve myself. I now want to be Pharaoh. This is my day to be Pharaoh. I've got something I want to do. I've now said that I'm more important than God. Because Sabbath was good enough for God. Sabbath was something that he gave as a sign for all the generations. And now I've said, you know what? Pharaoh matters more at this moment. Mark 2:27-28 says, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And we hear this so many times when people want to tell us that the Sabbath is done away with, that we don't need to do this. But nowhere in this verse does it say, Sabbath was made for man, so therefore man can do what it wants with it. That's not what it says. It says Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And when we understand the principle of Shabbat, when we understand that its principle is to show not just that he is the creator of all universe, but that he's a good creator, that he is the king who serves his people with humility, that he is the king who truly has the well-being of his servants in mind, that he is the king who is compassionate and merciful to all who come into his reign. That's why the Sabbath is made for man. That's why it's important. And that's why Yeshua is Lord of the Sabbath. So what should we do? What does it look like for us today? It's very different today than it was for Israel in the desert, right? I mean, we were talking about this past week, some friends of mine, when we're talking about the law and the way it's covenantal, relational. It was given to us on the foundation of being built upon, because Sabbath in the desert looks very different than Sabbath in Monroe, Louisiana. But does that mean that we treat it any differently? No. What does it look like to us? It looks like that we honor it in a way that Isaiah says. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. I love this verse. I love it mainly because this was a heavy-hitting verse for me back in the day. Back when I used to host tailgate parties at ULM on Sabbath. Thinking I was doing what God wanted me to do. I was resting. I wasn't working. I wasn't causing other people to work. But was I doing my own pleasure or the pleasure of God? Was I doing something that was honorable to Him? Was I displaying the fact that He was our Creator, our King, and our humble servant? I wasn't, right? That's why I love this verse. This was a verse that was a strong correction for me back in the day, and it's still a strong correction at times because we always have this inclination to do our own pleasure. We all have this inclination to want to make ourselves pharaohs, to build our own personal palaces, to make our houses greater than the tabernacle of God. And I'm not saying that, I have to work, right? I think we've established that that's not what we're saying here, that those who are forced into labor and forced into, because we live in Assyria, we live in the world, we live in a place where people don't acknowledge and recognize God's sovereign kingship and His instructions. That's not what I'm saying, but given the opportunity, what do? Do we speak our own words or do we speak the words of God? And I love to go back to the tabernacle here because there was a portion in the tabernacle that was set apart for bread. And the table of showbread there, the language there is intimately tied to the language of discipleship and what it means to carry the bread of God into the world. And this bread was placed in the midst of the tabernacle, the holy place, every week, but it was only consumed once a week. It was consumed on the Sabbath day. The priest ate all the loaves of bread on the Sabbath day. So are we consuming ourselves with our own bread, with our own words and our own pleasures? Are we taking part of God's bread on His holy day? It's not a point of contention or a point of judgment. Hopefully it's a point of encouragement for us to look and reassess where we're at with Sabbath and say, does our house matter more than God's house? So with that, we'll end with prayer. And we have oneg today. I almost like this better than our regular seating anyway. The tables, I wish we could do oneg every week. But we'll go to prayer here and give God thanks. Thank you, Father, for bringing us together, for gathering us on your holy day, for gathering us on your Shabbat. Thank you for giving us your instructions, your Torah, giving us the words that we can use as a guide to light our path, giving us the words that we can use to make your light stronger in the world around us. Thank you for allowing us to be your servants, your laborers, the ones who show the rest of the world that we serve the good King, the good and sovereign Creator of the universe. Thank you for giving us the pleasure and the opportunity, the responsibility, and the stewardship of maintaining your day with your people. Thank you for giving us a place, a type of Goshen in the world to where we can come together and show the world that we are separate. Thanks for teaching us what it means to be humble, a humble servant, a true leader of your people. Thanks for giving us the opportunity to come together in a way that the Israelites did, having to labor for our kings, our worldly kings, but still honoring you. I pray that you make us to grow as numerous as the Israelites, our fathers, in the land of Goshen, so that the rest of the world will look around and say, these people serve the greatest king, one that's not contained by walls and borders and worldly institutions, but a kingdom that has no borders, a kingdom that has no walls. We thank you for your love, for your mercy, for your compassionate sovereignty. We love you, we bless you. We thank you for all the provisions that you brought today for ONAG, and we thank you for the ability to fellowship together. Amen.